Welcome to the Disability Sport Info Show, the podcast that explores academic knowledge about disability sport. My name is Dr. Chris Brown, and I'm an academic with an expertise in disability sport. Each episode, I focus on a specific topic of disability sport and speak to academic experts to understand the area in more depth. So, join me and listen to the Disability Sport Info Show to get an expert view on disability sport. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining today to discuss the management and governance of Parasport. Always good to have the returning guests on the show. I want to really just talk about what Parasport is, how we can manage it, some of the governance approaches. Now, for listeners who aren't aware, David has a unique perspective.
Yeah, well, I've attended Paralympic Games in a variety of administrative roles and responsibilities, but as an able-bodied person. I was the president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, but Bob Stedward was, of course, the founding president of the International Paralympic Committee and my mentor and my supervisor for my PhD when I moved to the University of Alberta in Edmonton.
You wear many hats, and those hats will be useful today for our discussion. So I think just to kick off, what is Parasport?
I think it's fair to do it the most difficult question. Well, maybe it's not that difficult, but I think I would say adapted physical activity is perhaps the bigger, broader umbrella term, which would then include fitness, physical education, recreation, leisure across all impairments. And then, that would also then include sport for persons who are deaf or hard of hearing, although people in the deaf community and the deaf culture might take exception to that and suggest that they do not fit within adapted physical activity. I would say adaptive physical activity would then include sport and recreation for persons with intellectual disability, developmental delay, impairments such as autism. Parasport, for many people, would probably then categorize sport and recreation for persons with a physical disability or mobility impairment like visual impairment. This is where it gets tricky to kind of have a hard line in that the Paralympic system now includes and has included individuals with intellectual disability for a number of years, whereas many people might have said that the Parasport system excluded that. And so I think that what is defined as Parasport is constantly evolving, and it's great. I'm not sure there are hard lines that you could put around it insofar as exactly what it is. And in my own opinion, I'm not sure it really makes a lot of difference in a practical setting insofar as people's understanding and just the actual, the programming side of things on the ground. So Parasport, I think for many people would probably gear towards the sports that you would see in Paralympic sports. So primarily those that have a physical disability or a mobility disability. The question then becomes, well, where does the line get drawn between recreation, grassroots, community parasport, and high performance parasport? So where does competition at a high performance level begin and end? Is participating in a Commonwealth Games, now you're a high performance athlete, is a Pan American, is a national championships. And the evolution of parasport and adaptive physical activity is such that the steps between grassroots and community sport and recreation and high performance sport are sometimes not very big still to this day. Whereas in other sports, they are much more sophisticated and complicated. And so I think as a whole, it's really hard to have kind of definitions and terms that are going to be accepted and understood and true in every context. That's a long answer to a short question.
It is, but you navigated the tricky question first up quite well. So congrats for that. I think it's a fine point you make in terms of that it's not consistent throughout the system. Certain sports are maybe more refined and developed than others when it comes to the pathway and the management. You get that to a certain extent, of course, in able-bodied sport, but it's probably more exacerbated in a parasport context, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah. So I would agree. And part of that might just be evolution. And so the parasport system, the adaptive physical activity system is arguably, less than 100 years old, certainly. And maybe, if you were to suggest that it started post-World War II, well, we're only kind of 70 years in. And so that's not that long of a time when we're talking about a relatively smaller population base than the able-bodied system. And so I think that's to be expected. And perhaps even the growth and evolution is beyond what would have been reasonably expected. And so maybe we were ahead of the curve insofar as our development and evolution.
So when we're thinking about how to manage parasport, and I'm air quotes parasport, which obviously listeners can't see, but parasport with that kind of loose term that we've just talked about. So when we're thinking about the stakeholders involved, who are they And are there certain power dynamics or involvement that we need to be aware of for certain stakeholders? And how does it differ from able-bodied sport?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of stakeholders and they all come to the system with different lived experiences and attitudes and expectations. And so I think that complicates it, but in a way that, again, is okay. And it's both the pro and the con of working in the system that I love, but I also find really, really challenging, is trying to consider and address all of the varied stakeholders' opinions. And so first and foremost, we have the individual with the lived experience who's the participant. Disability is not a homogeneous collection of individuals. No population is, but perhaps disability, that's even more exacerbated. And so the lived experience of an individual with a spinal cord injury versus someone with a visual impairment versus someone with a developmental delay, like that, they're very different. But yet we lump them all under the one umbrella of impairment or disability. And then we try to treat them as a homogeneous group and try to do programming and governance that is going to address all of their needs. And that's just not reasonable. So there's that one stakeholder, and that's just one. And then you add in all the others, the more traditional sports system in and of itself. So the quote unquote able-bodied system that is, trying to be inclusive and equitable and accessible and create that sense of belonging. I'd like to think for the most part, they're benevolent and that they are wanting to do a good job. In many cases, they perhaps don't know how to, or they don't have the capacity or the resources to, in their opinion, do a great job. And so they avoid it. So there's that whole stakeholder group of the system that's already existing, trying to include and bring in persons with impairment. There's parents, there's teachers in the school system, there's government leaders, there's sponsors. It's a galaxy of different stakeholders that all have touch points on the system itself. The list of stakeholders is long and it's complicated.
That's a really interesting point that I want to pick up on there. So I really like your phrasing about the galaxy of stakeholders. I think that's a neat summary. We can't cover everything. We don't have the time or the headspace to be able to deal with everyone. So primarily in this chat, we're probably going to be focusing more on policymakers, the kind of classic sports stakeholders, national governing bodies, Paralympic associations, those kind of organizations. Generally, sport stakeholder involvement is quite complex. It's the same with Parasport, of course. And obviously there's some unique qualities to that. What about how we think about Parasport when we're looking at how it's governed? Now, obviously, it can be different from each country and different systems that are used. But from your experience and from your perspective, what are the kind of typical governance approaches to high performance Parasport?
Well, I think, and I would guess in and around the 90s, this happened in a lot of countries where governments started to mandate inclusive policies and inclusive practices in education. And, you saw the end of specialized schools and you saw more inclusive education practices where children with impairment were included, and I'm using quotation marks, into the classrooms. And then the same thing happened in kind of the social recreation sports systems. And so governments mandated to national sport governing bodies. And that certainly happened in Canada. So Swimming Canada, I think, was the first who kind of put their hand up and said that they wanted to pursue that route where they would be responsible for all athletes at both, and, certainly the high performance level at the Olympic and at the Paralympic level. And so then you saw a cascading effect with most national sport governing bodies now, kind of taking that on that responsibility. But how they did it, there was a bit of a mishmash of approaches, a bit of a dog's breakfast of, do you hire a specific individual to be responsible for all of the programs and all of the services for all athletes with an impairment? Or do you have the marketing person be responsible for able-bodied and disabled, and the high performance sport person be responsible for both, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm not really sure which of those varied approaches actually were the best. I think it's in many cases just been dependent on the individuals that were responsible for these things and just how well-intentioned and motivated and educated they were on providing the appropriate programs and services and leadership in that context. Where we Canada ran into challenges, and I would suspect and suggest that this has probably been similar in other countries and other jurisdictions, is that this didn't happen in a coordinated or kind of a strategic way insofar as the system goes. And so the national sport organizations were tasked with this and were told and were mandated that you have to do this. If you want to get funding from the federal government, this is what you're going to do. But that didn't necessarily then translate at the provincial or the state level. And that didn't necessarily translate at the civic, local, grassroots level. And so for the last 25 years, we've had this kind of complexity of oversight and governance and policy that have not been coordinated or the same in the different jurisdictional levels and the different sport levels and the different disability levels. And so what we've resulted in is this highly complex and an unrelated system where you come in at this level and this is the organization and this is the group that would be responsible for your programming. And then you would go to this level and it's a totally different stream and system. And then you might come back over here. And again, it's a totally different stream and system who's responsible for the next level. And they tend not to connect and communicate. I think they do their best, but again, it's such a complicated system to ensure communication and systems and expectations are translated from one group to the next is really, really difficult. And so from the perspective of the participant and a coach and or a classifier or administrator, it's quite daunting to figure out and to kind of wayfind your way from point A to point B. So I would say that we're still kind of going through that system. If we could go back and just blow it up and start from scratch, then I think we could do a much better job of kind of setting it up and ensuring that everybody is on the same page and going forward. But, clearly we can't do that. And so we have to constantly try to adapt and adjust. It's the proverbial building the plane as it's flying. And so we're constantly trying to adjust and update it and make it more seamless than it is. But again, it's not easy to do.
No, and as you've pointed out, the areas only really become a focus or a kind of area of interest after able-bodied systems have been established. They're not going to just completely start from scratch. They obviously will adapt existing practices, but then that's created the fragmentation and perhaps inefficiencies that are sometimes seen in the governance.
Right.
So how do we make it more efficient? Easy question, right? Come on, how do we make it more efficient?
Oh, well.
$1 million question.
Yeah, just like this. I think the coordination of the different levels of government would be helpful, whereby you had a federal and a state provincial/provincial civic governments all come together and agree that the system was going to be managed and mandated and organized the same way. And that organizations would then be held accountable and responsible for those things with real teeth to it and not just like, whatever. I think that could be one step. I almost wonder if we try to do too much. Like Canada, I would say, is quite an egalitarian society where, we want to try to please everybody all the time and, make sure that everybody has full choice to do whatever. In some cases, there might be advantages to being maybe a bit more. I might live to regret what I'm about to say, but I sometimes wonder if we'd be better off if we just limited choice. And because then we would have more people to participate in smaller numbers of sports that we could then do a better job of organizing and managing as opposed to the plethora. And even like the Paralympic sports that we have, there are now hundreds of other options for people to participate in adapted physical activity options, which is great for somebody who really, really, really wants to do skydiving as a person with a spinal cord injury or like whatever's not on the Paralympic program, surfing or something like that. But because we have, a couple people here and a couple people there and a couple people there, it's just because of the sheer volume of people that are interested in participating. It just doesn't allow you to create these sophisticated, like complex systems. It's, volunteer here, volunteer there, volunteer there. And so, yeah, if we could have gone back and just only said, there are only 10 sporting options, people with impairment, that might have made it easier and better, for those who are participating in those sports. But again, that ship has sailed, so I can't change that. So how to make it better? I've been wrestling with that for the last 30 years of my professional career, and I haven't come up with a good answer yet.
You can't distill what you've been doing for 30 years into 2 minutes. Come on, David. You're losing your touch. There's kind of hinting about the tension that you get for the kind of sport for all philosophy, where everyone should have the opportunity to participate. versus actually you're trying to get a very focused, targeted approach to try and winning medals or, trying to be better at an elite perspective. They don't always necessarily mesh very well together.
No, agreed. Yeah, they are somewhat binary in that they don't have the same systems and goals. So maybe in my answer to the question you just asked, where I was saying if we had limited sports, that was kind of the high performance hat that I had on.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
Insofar as, if we wanted to have gold medals from a Canadian context, that would have been a better system for us if we had been more specialized or focused on a particular number of sports. But from the participants' perspective, in the desire to play lots of different sports, and if you took the high performance side out of it and you just wanted to be active and engaged in your community, then the system that we have where we are promoting a wide swath of opportunities is perhaps a better one. And maybe the two can coexist, where you could participate in a variety of sports at the grassroots level, and then you specialize and you focus on one to then perform at a high performance level. Maybe there's that opportunity too. And perhaps that's the next evolution of the Parasport system, is that we get to that point where, people with impairment are fully included in the entire grassroots sport recreation system. They're able to participate and play in any number of activities and are welcomed and have appropriate coaching and access to facilities. And then if they so choose to focus on a high performance side, they then have the avenues and the opportunities to do that too. Maybe that's Pollyannish and it will never happen, but I guess maybe if I could say that that's the end goal that we're trying to, pick away at and get to, maybe that's it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the kind of maturity and maturing aspect of the whole system. Still obviously relatively new when comparing it to able-bodied. And obviously for able-bodied systems, there's still a lot of complexity and inefficiency there too. So it's not like that's perfect.
No, that's true. That's true.
So governments obviously have played a very big role in terms of supporting elite sport. Either they put a lot of money in or they don't, or then maybe they have a particular viewpoint about where money should be going. Maybe it should be sport for all, maybe it should be high performance, but they obviously play a key role. So how do governments actually influence parasport and potential success at the Paralympics? And are there any examples that you want to draw upon as a kind of best practice or alternatively not good practice?
I'll start with kind of the how first, I guess. I think part of it is the accountability and the responsibility to do appropriate programming and the use of public dollars. And so if taxpayer dollars are going towards national sport organizations for the purposes of, creating systems or managing teams, and part of their mandate is to do the same for athletes with a disability and also able-bodied athletes, they need to be held accountable for that. And part of it is just the capacity of governments to, kind of watchdog this and to ensure that things actually happen and take place is the follow-up. And so I think governments are good at, asking and requesting that things happen, but I think less effective on the actual policing of it and the follow-up and, if the carrot and stick approach. So if it's not happening, the funding is pulled or the funding needs to be returned or those sort of things. So I think that's one of the steps that governments can do. I guess that's more of the stick approach. And then the carrot is the nudging them and helping them understand the benefits of doing so, recognizing that potentially there's greater sponsorship opportunities. The Toyotas of the world, for instance, are wanting to support organizations and programs and services that are inclusive and equitable in their approach. So, if a national sport governing body wants to be able to access some of these large multinational corporations from a financial perspective outside of the government funding, they're going to have to do this. And so governments can do them a service by allowing them and enabling them to understand that and to then access other funding outside of just the small pockets of government funding. I knew you were going to ask me about, benchmarks and good examples. And I got to be honest with you, I think Canada is my own home country. And so I think they do a pretty good job. And comparatively speaking, I would say perhaps better than most insofar as kind of their support of, marginalized, quote unquote, marginalized populations, whether that's disability, gender, sexual orientation, Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations. I would say that that's a focus of our systems and our funding. And right now there's a real focus on safe sport and ensuring that, athletes and coaches are able to participate in the sports system in a safe and welcoming and appropriate way. And so I would say that our government is strong in those systems, but the actual practice of it is sometimes harder. So to come up with the theory and to come up with the policy is one thing. To implement it in the grassroots level is sometimes different. I think where we struggle is the sheer size of our country. Again, in a country that has 5 time zones and a population really of only 35 million people, again, economies of scale is difficult to manage it in 2 official languages. And so it's difficult to sometimes manage the jurisdictional piece of it. So that, I think that makes it difficult to implement policies. I'm sometimes a little jealous of countries the size of the Netherlands, for instance, where you can drive from one side to the other in a couple of hours, it seems. And so you can connect people better together and you can coordinate things, I think, much more easily. Maybe that's my assumption anyhow. Maybe it's not the case. And maybe there are other barriers that make it difficult to implement policies at the grassroots level. But so I had a hard time. I had a hard time coming up with a specific example. The US and other countries have moved to a shared national system, the USOPC, so the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committees. I'm not sure that's the best model. So Canada still has a Canadian Paralympic Committee and a Canadian Olympic Committee, and they work well together on shared initiatives. But I'm biased too, right? I'm a past president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee. I don't know if a merger would be in the best interests of athletes with impairment in a Canadian context. I don't know that. And so I don't know if one system is better than the other. And so I had a hard time coming up with an example for that second part of your question.
It's not necessarily an easy question to answer. And also, we don't necessarily have the answer at this stage. Like, the theme of our conversation so far is that there's still development to happen in terms of the system. But that's true across all sport, I'd say, in terms of the elite aspect. There's still a lot of development to happen. For those who are of a UK interest or UK focus, we do have the difference between Paralympic Association and Olympic Association. So that's a clear divide. We also had an approach called the no compromise approach to funding, which was essentially where UK sport would use government money from the National Lottery to fund sports that they felt were going to have a realistic chance of winning a medal. And then when you talk about the policing of it, they were saying that basically if you didn't meet the targets, you potentially have it reduced or pulled altogether. But if you did well, you might get more money, etc. Now, this led to very good success for Team GB and Paralympics GB, but it also was criticised because basically there was a haves and a have-nots, and create quite a short-termist approach. You were always pretty much going to try and meet the funding targets, otherwise you didn't have the money. And for a lot of sports, they were very dependent on UK sports funding. So it's kind of been changed now. So that was a kind of a clear approach. It had brought success, but also brought criticism. And it's kind of leading on to my next question. So thanks for listening to the monologue so far. To extend the monologue, what I would say is that in academia, there is a theory, or at least a model, to try and suggest how governments can influence high-performance sport systems. You, David, will know about this. It's called the SPLIS model. So for those who aren't aware, SPLIS stands for Sport Policy Factors Leading to International Sport and Success. The authors fully accepted and admitted that probably leading was a little bit, ironically, misleading, and actually perhaps would be more about contributing to potential success. The idea is basically governments or a funding body put money into the system. That's an input. And then how you invest that money is important. So you need to have a broad base. Yep. You need to identify and develop talent. You need to support athletes. Give them training facilities, have coach supply and education. You also need to have competitions for athletes to be able to hone their skills and craft, and sports science and innovation support. And now those are the areas that policymakers can make a difference. Is that the case for Parasport in terms of using the SPLIS model?
I was involved with the SPLIS study from a Canadian perspective with the original study that Dr. David led in 2004, and then the second iteration in and around 2012. And over that time, actually, it evolved from a focus on just the able-bodied system in 2004. And what was interesting is when I was actually participating in the study, I presumed high-performance athletes meant Olympic and Paralympic athletes, and that had never been discussed fully with all of the 6 original kind of partners to it. Anyways, over time, it evolved to include Paralympic athletes, but I would say the majority of the model was developed with an able-bodied system in mind. And then Dr. Pattis has tried to look at whether or not this would be applicable in a Paralympic context. And I would say for the most part, it is. Now, I also think it's worth recognizing, though, that, there was recognition that medal success is also highly dependent on, a country's kind of socioeconomic status, generally speaking, and population size. And so those two things in and of themselves account for a pretty big chunk of, medal success for countries. You can't impact that. I mean, as a sport administrator, I can't increase population of my country, and I can't really impact the socioeconomic kind of where my country sits from a GDP perspective. But what I can influence are the items that you talked about, the different pillars within the system that we can influence from. If you looked at the system as a factory, a machine, right? The input, and then what you do in the factory, and then the output. And so the things that you just listed off are all those things that happen in the factory that lead to the output of quote unquote more medals. I would say for the most part, yeah. Those are the same things that should and could lead to medal success. So the sport policies leading to, international sporting success. I would say that they are very similar, if not the same, in an able-bodied context to a disability parasport context. The complexity, though, is, so for instance, the one example that you talked about, well, you probably go through all of, coaching as an example. And so, in a Canadian context, there's a robust kind of coaching evolution system from grassroots to high performance. Insofar as, coaches learn at the earliest grassroots level, they have to take these courses to allow them to be a coach of their 6-year-old in a local football soccer program. But at the disability system, it's not quite as clear insofar as entry and then progression throughout. And so that's what, I would suspect that coaching is a pretty important pillar within the parasport context for medal success. But the system that actually allows that to happen isn't as well-defined or as kind of well arranged at the moment. We're working on it. I mean, we're picking away at it bit by bit. The other one would be the grassroots system. And so, we talked about earlier how physical education was done in specialized schools in the 80s and the 90s, and then it transitioned into a more inclusive system. And I would argue that that has failed our children with impairments from a physical literacy and a fundamental motor skill perspective, and that they're not participating in physical education. They're just sitting off on the other side. And that's a whole other conversation. But nonetheless, a effective grassroots system where children with impairment are learning multiple physical literacy skills and sport skills, and then able to participate in a variety of activities would be one of the pillars leading to sporting success. So I would say that the pillars themselves, if you just itemize them, are the right ones. But so you're not comparing apples to apples insofar as the able-bodied system to the parasport system with those pillars.
Yeah, exactly. And also the point you made about socioeconomic factors and kind of population size, there are, not to get too technical for listeners, but there are macro and micro factors that can also influence success. So macro would be kind of wider external things like population size, GDP, gross domestic product of a country, kind of political system, the geography, perhaps, of the nation. And then micro kind of looks at the athlete, the kind of individual bit, talent, genetics, the support network for the athlete, etc. And I never know how to say it. Is it meso or meso level? Whatever you prefer. That is where the Spliss model kind of lies. So that's where, in theory, we do have some influence, like David said. So that's where policymakers can make a difference. So yeah, I mean, I would agree, based on my limited knowledge compared to you, but it's always going to be less developed, I'd say, some of those pillars. And then also you've got those unique factors like how big is the disability population within that country? What are the attitudes towards disabled people in terms of society? How much heritage has that country got in terms of accessibility and also involvement in parasport? That could also play a role. So the UK has been from the beginning in terms of the Paralympics. Some other nations probably a little bit later, etc. So yeah, there's lots of complexity, and obviously government play an important role, and there are there's kind of different factors that we've talked about. So probably bringing the conversation to a close now. We've talked about some of the challenges, we've alluded to that. Where do we see parasport governance and management going in the future? In the kind of next few years, what kind of developments do you think potentially will happen, and what should happen if they are potentially different?
I would say there are a number of evolutions that are happening outside of sport that will ultimately have an impact on the parasport system. And so one, I think, is this focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and justice, perhaps, if you wanted to include that as one of the terms as well. And so I think there's a reckoning and a recognition. In a Canadian context, we talk about reconciliation as it relates to Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations persons. But I would say that that's happening with other marginalized populations as well. And I think this is happening outside of sport too, where we're recognizing the value and the importance of a more inclusive society. So I think that's number one. I think number two is just the rapid evolution of technology. And I think that will be a game changer and has been a game changer as it relates to the inclusion of individuals with impairments. This idea of technology enabling people to do certain things is like, it's unbelievable to think about the future, and whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality, technology as it relates to prosthetics and sport wheelchairs, and the ability for an individual with an impairment to compete equitably, if not with an advantage against the person who's able-bodied. I think that's a game changer in the next 20 or 30 years, could really change the way we look at sport and competition. And I think there's going to be this idea of doping, I think, is going to evolve very quickly from, a use of steroids or blood transfusions to technology. I think the next 10 to 15, 20 years, that's going to be a real game changer insofar as how people with impairment compete against able-bodied athletes. So I think the technology piece of it is also a massive game changer. And then the third one, I would argue, is just the globalization of everything. And so, countries operating in isolation, I think it just doesn't happen anymore. Ideas and concepts are just free flowing from one context to the other. And so, what suddenly becomes a good idea in one country is going to very quickly, translate into another. And so I would say that the curve of change is going to happen rapidly as well, insofar as just the exchange of ideas. So I think those three things are really going to change the governance and the model of parasport and adapted physical activity, in some cases for the good. But I mean, again, it's hard to predict too how some of these are going to impact the delivery and the actual day-to-day practical, application of sport and recreation at the grassroots level. I think that's important for policymakers and academics and practitioners to kind of keep their eye on it and make sure that, the changes that are happening are for the better.
There actually is an episode about technology and innovation in parasport. So do catch that one with Bryce. We talked about during that episode, 3D printing, is of making the ability to get prosthesis more readily accessible. One of the barriers for some countries was, the cost, of course. Yeah. So that's still potentially going to be an issue, but that is getting cheaper, more accessible than ever before. And it's going to be some interesting ethical and moral dilemmas about what we consider to be too much of a technological advantage and what potentially considers cheating or is, kind of assisting. So that will be interesting to see. I think some really interesting points there. And I think it's a fine way to end. We look to the future. We can't be wrong yet. So that's always good.
That's the best job in the world, is being a futurist.
Yeah. Moan about this episode in 20 years' time. We'll see if we actually get But they're obviously going to be, and also I think also to point out that athlete welfare is going to be becoming even more of an important topic, I think, as we go, when athletes become more empowered and feel more empowered to speak out about their experiences. It's going to inform coach education. It's going to inform administrators in terms of how they actually are going to be managing the system. So I think that's also going to be something which potentially can hopefully change the system for the better as well.
Agreed.
All right. Well, David, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to catch up and have a chat. And I appreciate you in the early hours of your morning spending time with me chatting about management and governance of parasport. So thank you so much. I look forward to catching up with you soon.
All right. Take care.
Excellent. Cheers. You've been listening to the Disability Sport Info Show, academic insights into disability sport.